some new faces today. So in case you don't know, we are an organization called Echo Symposium, and we host talks like this to give an open forum or a platform for students to discuss issues that are somehow related to China or the US-China relationship, for example. And today we're very honored to have invited Professor Roberts. Professor Roberts is the Ilson Professor of Environmental Science, Environmental Studies and Sociology. He got his PhD from Johns Hopkins University in Sociology's program in Comparative International Development. He's the co-author and editor of 12 books and edited volumes, and of over 80 articles and book chapters. Professor Roberts is also co-founder of 8data.org. He is part of an international effort to produce a quantum leap in transparency in climate finance and foreign aid more broadly. So we welcome him today to talk with us about some of his thoughts on China and climate change. Without further ado, welcome. Thank you so much.
So, thanks to your persistent colleague, and you.
Okay. No
thank
problem.
you for camping at my office or something.
Really
and found me.
that, because you're the key people in environmental studies at Brown. So most knowledgeable person here about this topic.
So thanks for finding me. That's good. I really look forward to a discussion. I want to have this be quite informal. I don't want to get into a big long PowerPoint. I brought Shiho. How do I pronounce it? Zahao. Who is in my Climate and Development Lab group, which is about 12 undergraduates who all travel to the UN climate change negotiations in Lima, Peru, back in December. And each year I bring a group of students, and we work as sort of a think tank through a whole academic year, producing policy, research briefing papers, blogs. We do tweeting and other kind of scholarly articles, and we produce books, and we have 2 books coming out this year. One is called Power in a Warming World, with David Siplet, who's a doctoral student, just finished his PhD. And that's looking at the global geopolitics of climate change, global politics. And then another one focused on Latin America with Guy Edwards, who's my research fellow, as the lead author. So what I thought I would just bring up, because China keeps coming up in all this work, the work on Latin America and the work that's sort of focused globally, because it's such an important country. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how China's important, why is it so important, why it matters, what role China's played in the UN climate negotiations since 1992, what happened in Copenhagen in 2009, where China was an important group that decided the outcome, and then also got some bad publicity for some of its actions there. And then sort of how its posture is changing, and then especially this surprising announcement in November with the United States it was a joint announcement of 2 separate pledges of what they're going to do about climate change, how they're going to reduce emissions in the next period, which is being agreed this year in the negotiations, which will be held in Paris in December. And I'll be bringing another group of students to that. So trying to understand whether that was an ambitious pledge by China and the United States, and whether they were, how about those pledges meant. And then also one thing that's come up a lot is China's search for raw materials, and especially oil and natural gas in Latin America, where I do research, but also in other parts of the world, and what that means. And then finally, if we could talk a little bit about urban air pollution, and whether Beijing air is just so bad that it's driving a new kind of attention to climate change in China. And this is where I need you all. I need you all for all of these topics to help fill in my knowledge. I'm very open to ideas. So stop me at any time. How does that sound?
Great.
Great. So China is a big emitter, right, of global warming gases. So I didn't bring a PowerPoint. I just brought one graph. So these are, this top line, this is from our book that's coming out. This is from the EU, the European Union Joint Research Center, the JRC, showing through 2013. This is pretty brand new data. It takes a while for them to get all this data. This black line at the top is the United States, rising and then starting to fall after about 2006. So the US has really done a lot, or rather has managed to stop the rise of, to level off, and then to reduce its emissions in the last about 7 years. And it's not that the US can claim all the credit for that. There was an economic recession. There was a switch to natural gas and away from coal. And there was also fuel efficiency standards in cars and some building efficiency and so on. But probably of the three of those, the economic recession and the sort of the rise of cheap natural gas explains a lot of this drop in the United States. So the Obama administration can claim a little bit of credit for this, but not a whole lot. They have been very focused on coal. Now, the other line, here's the European Union, which is also dropping, but not even as fast as the US. And then here's China. So, third in the world largely, if you include the whole EU as a group, until about 2003, and then just pretty much skyrocketing until the present, and still rising very quickly, and becoming now about 30% of all emissions. The United States is about 16%. Did I get that right? I think that's right. So it used to be, of course, the US was the largest emitter until just about 2006. And of course, what's in the atmosphere now causing the warming includes much of the emissions that were put up there over the last 100 years. Carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for 100 years. So who's the most historically responsible is the United States and Europe, Japan, Australia, Canada, the big, and the highly industrialized, earlier industrialized countries. And then those who have also had a lot of emissions from land use change, namely deforestation. And rice paddies do emit methane as well, which is a big problem. Methane is a much stronger greenhouse gas, but it stays in the atmosphere for a shorter time. But it's about 25 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So it's a complicated picture, but the US is more historically responsible, but looking at the present, China is already more responsible. And if we look even just 10 or 20 years in the future, China will soon be responsible for more than anybody else of what's up there. So that's the kind of the question of why China matters. This is actually a question of what's going on with China in the last few years, right? Jumping ahead, the announcement with the United States in November was that the US would reduce its emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025 from 2005 levels, which is, it's not that great of a pledge, but it's something. It means a speeding up of this drop in emissions that you're seeing here. And it's a pledge that's kind of good because it's only 5 more years after 2020, so it's pretty soon, and it shows another tick downward from the rate that's happening now. China's pledge was to peak its emissions by 2030. So this line, if we go out here, here's 2000, here's 1990, so 2000, 2010, 2020, 2030. So it's going to stop rising somewhere over here, right? But that's a very squishy pledge, right? We don't know at what level it's going to peak. They never said that. It's good to have a peak year. I think that's important. The other part of the pledge was, correct me if I get this wrong, 30% renewable energy
Yes.
by 2030 also. And was there any other parts of the pledge?
I think so.
That was
that's
about
it.
it? Yeah. But we heard some news reports. Did you ever learn more about this? That Chinese emissions may have actually peaked in 2014 because of turning off of coal-fired power plants.
Yeah, that's what you told me last time.
What's that?
That's what you told me last time at your office about
Yeah.
the peak in curved years.
I mean, imagine if this rose till here and then is already flat and may have actually gone down. It's just 1 year of data though, and we have to make sure that it holds up. But if that's a fact,
there's like the slowing down of the economy is definitely
Yeah.
playing a role in it, and it's not gonna be like this it's not gonna be a sustainable phenomenon. The consumption is gonna rise up again and then peak in 2030.
Yeah.
That's the situation.
or at least not now. That's
Right.
probably a lot more realistic expectation.
Because if there's like a commitment, and they want to be seen by international standards as like complying to the commitment,
Right.
then wouldn't they just emit as much as possible before 2030?
That's the
Or like
idea.
change the industry so that
That's
like
like
the
sort
next
of the
10 years.
leeway they set up so that they
Okay.
can, yeah.
So China has said okay, the other thing was in Copenhagen, China joined with, in this group called BASIC, Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. So 4 countries. BASIC, Brazil, South Africa, India, China, and the United States. The 5 of them went in a back room. Actually, the 4 of them were meeting, and Barack Obama burst into the room and said, wait a minute, guys, we should all talk together. And they wrote a whole new agreement, the Copenhagen Accord, which was just 12 paragraphs, and it totally changed the way the negotiations have been going and started a whole new model of sort of bottom-up pledges. Countries would just offer what they want to do, and then other countries would review it. So it's called pledge and review. And so China was actually got some bad press. There was one article by a guy named Mark Linus, who had another controversial article this last weekend about a week ago in the New York Times about genetically modified crops. But he said, how do I know China, what was the word? How do I know China derailed the Copenhagen negotiations? I was in the room. So he was one helping negotiate for a Pacific island and described China's role as being very, very negative. So what was I saying about that? So China's, I think under some pressure to be more constructive in the talks. And, after Copenhagen, in describing its position, the lead negotiator, whose name is, I want to pronounce it my bad American pronunciation, Shishanhua.
Mm-hmm.
Can you pronounce it properly?
I think that's about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he said in a talk at a university in China that it's about development space. That is, China wants to protect its ability to move forward with its economic development. And, with hundreds of millions of people still without electricity, in rural areas, China has a long way to go to reach even basic levels of standard of living for so much of its population. So China is rightly defending its right to do so. So the development space issue, I think when they made that pledge of 2030, they're protecting their ability. They think in about 10 years, right, or 15 years, they can bring, most people will be moving into cities, right? There'll be huge growth in cities.
And also the idea of, the renewable energy is going to make up a huge proportion of the energy mix. And by then, the whole industry will be upgraded into a more fine-grained fashion, as opposed to right now, it's like very raw manufacturing industry.
Right.
So that's also put into the consideration of the equation, and hopefully we can cap the emissions by then.
Yeah. And hopefully it's not just by exporting the industry to other countries, right? That other places will be doing what China's doing now. But it is moving up the value chain, as they say, right? Moving away from just producing the raw materials, or the lower stages of processing of raw materials.
Definitely.
Did you say China exporting industry?
Sorry?
Did you just say China exporting
Well,
industry?
right. Sometimes it's now importing the, aluminum or the processed cardboard or
into Asian countries,
into other Asian countries.
Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia. Yeah.
So it's making a transition, moving up the chain of value added in commodity chains.
Just out of curiosity, where's India in terms
Yeah, India, okay, so India is really low. I don't think it shows on this. We have all the other big developing countries is this dashed line. So this is Brazil and India, South Africa. But if you do it in per capita terms, let me see if we have that here.
Per capita term, India is
Yeah, here it is.
negligible.
Here it is. Okay, so I'm sorry this is black and white, because here's the US has dropped significantly. It's the top per capita. This is 20 tons of carbon dioxide per capita. So it's carbon dioxide, so it's about 3 times. If you divide by 3, you get roughly what would be in terms of tons of carbon, because some people use that. Here's Russia. You can see it drops off because of the economic collapse after the wall fell. Here's Japan. Here's the European Union, is this next line, and you can see China rising from about 3 tons per capita to about 7, which is the same as the EU, 7 or 8 tons. So now China's at the same level as the European Union. That surprised everybody when that happened. And then here's India down here. See this very bottom line? It's almost, it's 1 to 2 tons per capita. So 1/10 what the US is.
So the U.S. still like emitting more carbon dioxide per capita than China and European
are.
Union?
Yeah. We're still up here about 16 and they're down, you guys are down about 8. So twice. It used to be 5 times as much. I mean, not long ago when we did our book that we published in 2007, we were using 2005 data. We thought China was about 1/3 or 1/5 of the US. Now it's half.
I think like the Chinese government, they initiated like a very strong economic stimulus project by the year 2008, right after the financial crisis. Like they inject like a huge tons of money into the market to stimulate the manufacturing and industrial sectors, which create a huge improvement in domestic productions.
Yeah.
I think that's probably one of the reasons there is a sharp increase in
This line here.
after 2008.
Yeah, and there was also in the stimulus package in the United States, as a result of the economic crisis, was included a lot of the green stimulus towards energy efficiency.
Also, it's like actually the direction is like different to which the stimulus package is applied to China and the United States.
Yeah, China's was much larger as a proportion of the economy. Great point. So what else? China's role in the negotiations for a long time had been really protecting that development space, and I guess that's the question, is whether with this joint announcement, whether it's at least acknowledging that it's needs to be part of not just resisting and playing a defensive role, but actually needs to be part of an evolving solution. So the science, in very rough terms, is that pre-industrial levels of carbon dioxide and all the other greenhouse gases were about 280 parts per million up there, and now we're at 400. We just passed 400 last year. So you've heard of the group 350.org. We're already well past the 350 parts per million threshold, which is associated with about 1.5 degree of warming global average in Celsius over the old pre-industrial levels. 450 parts per million is expected to get us to 2 degrees of warming, which is right at the level at which we start to see worse and worse impacts. So there's a lot of pressure on negotiators, on countries right now, to come in with pledges this year, right? This is the sort of deadline year for this Paris Agreement that's going to come into effect in 2020, but to put us on a trajectory that'll keep us underneath 2 degrees of warming.
The idea is that once you reach the 2 degrees above the pre-industrial level, you basically go down the road. There's no way to reverse that. And given the current situation, the amount of emissions already in the air, it's even very doubtful. It's actually like even we can maintain the same level, it's probably gonna hit that. Probably gonna cross the Rubicon and trigger consequential, other consequences. And so, I mean, the call for the immediate actions is really imminent, and the negotiators are having a hard time to come at a pact. But right now, it's what we are striving for, basically.
What's been interesting though this year, and I think the U.S.-China joint announcement was really important in this, that there is kind of a rolling out of pledges. They're not called pledges, they are pledges, but they're called intended nationally determined contributions, or INDCs. It's like this baggy language from the negotiations. Intended nationally determined contributions. In other words, contribution means pledge. Nationally determined means you make your own pledge. Nobody else tells you what to do. And then it's intended, so it's not, that's not even,
It's not
binding, right, it's not binding. But that's what, there's still a little bit of discussion about whether this will be any kind of a binding agreement. I think one person whose hands are tied is Barack Obama by the Senate and the House in the US, who are trying to stop him from doing anything binding. So it will continue to be probably just these voluntary pledges. But the China-US announcement came out, the EU came out with a very strong pledge of like 40% or something by 2030 reductions. Mexico came out with a pledge to peak its emissions by 2026, which I think is great because it's sooner than China's, whatever. It's showing that they're sort of willing to, and they're industrializing as well. So we're kind of hopeful. Japan's just came out yesterday or the day before, and it's pretty weak, but they had this, the tsunami and the Fukushima nuclear plant meltdown that caused them to shut off all their nuclear power plants, so their emissions are rising. So for them to, they're pledging a 25 or 26% reduction by 2030 from 2013 levels, which is the worst part of their pledge, is that it's off such a recent baseline year. But anyway, it seems like there's a kind of a nice dynamic going this year where countries are trying to get some good publicity by actually making decent pledges. And I've heard from a sort of a US government source that if you add up all the pledges now that they're expecting this year, it would keep us to about 2.5 degrees of warming, which is across the Rubicon, as you said. We're starting to see irreversible changes, and some of these things cause other changes, like melting of the permafrost, which releases more methane and stuff. But 2.5 sounds a lot better than what we expected a year or two ago, which was 3.5 or 4 degrees of warming. So anyway, I think it's relatively nice. It's been an exciting year, and there's some potential for more positive things to happen. You want to add anything else about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think, I mean, just by looking at the goal set up by EU, the 40% reduction aim, and you really have to look at the individual countries. For example, like Germany produces 70% of its energy through renewable sources. And I think for the US and China, they are like great models to look at to really.
Germany is,
yeah.
Especially,
A lot of like energy issues can be like renewable energy industry can be induced by the government through appropriate policies like rebates, like trading tariffs and cap and trade, that sort of thing. But it really requires the governments to integrate their wisdom into the market mechanism. And these are like the nitty-gritties of the economy that could contribute to emission reduction. So the idea of binding those countries together to make a pact or like a bilateral agreement of emission reduction was to group those the very important emitters in the world to basically to develop a set of emission reduction goals on their own, so that they can, when the negotiators come on the table and negotiate in COP21, they can the big obstacles are partly solved even before that, and I think that's the way to go in onwards basically.
We had the Indian environment minister, former environmental ministry.
Yeah, he's so cool.
Jairam Ramesh, who was visiting in Watson, come to our lab group and to my class as well, and he really sees Germany as the model. I think it's really inspired him.
Dismissive about the small islanders issues. I don't know why.
I think India is, and you saw how low their per capita emissions are. They're desperate for some growth, and they're sitting on all this very soft coal, which is highly polluting. And, so he said India will continue to burn coal. It's reduced the number of coal plant construction projects, but it still is building some coal. So there's two more topics left on the list here. One is the search for raw materials and petroleum in Latin America. So in our research on Latin America, there's some very interesting stuff has come up. For example, Chinese companies and the government, I think they're state-owned, largely companies, making deals with, for example, the Venezuelan government, extending what are called commodity-backed loans, where they say, here's the pile of money, you can pay us in oil over the next 30 years, and they'll lock in a price. The price will have to be the same from the moment that the deal was struck for the 30 years. I don't know if it's corrected for inflation. I suppose so.
It's kind of like a financial instrument.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think China's doing the same thing with Russia as well.
Yeah.
Wait.
So it makes sense for Russia to do so, for China to do so to secure its energy picture, right? As it wants to have, a diverse source of income over time. But it does lock these countries like Venezuela and Bolivia into, having natural resource export as the core of its sort of development project, and exporting oil especially tends to have pretty negative impacts on the politics in countries. It leads to corruption that can cause a very unstable government as a big pulse of money comes in, and then there's demands for social programs, and then the price of oil collapses or something happens, and then there's a rebellion. So.
Yeah, I was on this project myself, so I guess I could say a thing or two. The way to look at China's investment in Latin America, a lot of it has to do with the subsidiary of state-owned companies investing and building infrastructure on the ground in exchange of natural resources like minerals or oil or natural gas. And you could look at it as sort of an export of development model, which is built on the development model of China itself, of big industry, big manufacturing industry that really drain on the natural resource reserve. And if this model is exported elsewhere, that on one hand it increases global production, but on the other hand, definitely ramp up emissions in Latin America as well. So I guess the question is whether or not China could direct its fund not just on basic infrastructure and other emission high emission industry, but also like renewable energy in Latin America, because there isn't enough like industry or utility like grid system on the ground, it's easier to incorporate those renewable source energy than say like industrial countries like the US. So that's another angle to look at the whole issue, and I think for the Chinese government to make a wise decision, it really has to balance out the financial gain and also environmental externality.
Yeah, and of course China is now the world's leading producer of solar panels and windmills, wind turbines, and has a commanding lead, right?
Exactly.
In the world, and is producing what this cheapening on both of those fronts, but especially the solar panels are getting really cheap from China.
For this
And
project,
so that would be huge for Latin America, hugely helpful.
definitely. For this project, I looked up the Commerce and Trade Ministry, the official website, and they have like very specific guides as to how to conduct business in Latin America, but also like report about how many companies are involved in China-Latin America trade. And I just browsed through the whole list, and basically 80 or 90% of the companies are big industry companies, and only like 1 or 2 is like in the solar panel companies. So I guess the makeup should be more balanced.
More balanced.
Yeah.
And so do they have to get approved by the Chinese government to be in that program?
What program?
Each company needs to get listed in that list, or that's just the list of who is actually doing business
Oh,
in the
it's
region?
just like a record of the other
okay.
companies on the ground.
But the government's, whatever, the government can support the export of Chinese renewables. Anyway, that's a lot of what we are.
I mean, the thing about renewable energy is that if you really want to take advantage of the economy of scale, you better increase its use globally. So say if California increases its solar industry, solar rooftop installation, it's going to drive down the cost elsewhere. So it makes sense for the Chinese companies to invest in Latin America. I mean, renewable energy companies to invest in Latin America to make the domestic market more profitable.
Just out of curiosity, does the construction of those solar panels and wind turbine requires more energy consumption or pollution? I've just read randomly on the news that it says one solar panel manufacturing company in China produced some not radioactive but highly polluted metal to the soil that devastated their lands.
Right, it's not without environmental impact to create this stuff. That's an important issue.
That plays into a
It takes some time, a number of years for the energy costs in creating the panels to be sort of paid off.
Exactly. There's a paid off time, and also the business situation is quite complex because there are 2 ways to make solar panels, and one way doesn't require wafer, the other does, and wafer is definitely very polluting. And a company in California called Sinclair, I think, went bankrupt because the wafer used to drive down the solar panel production cost, but then silicon becomes cheaper and the production of solar panel becomes cheaper in China, and they export it, and the company was basically crowded out. So yeah, the whole situation is a very complex, dynamic business situation involved that the government also involved and the consumers also involved. So yeah.
So actually, like, how durable are those solar devices and windmills? Usually,
At least 10 years, I think.
10 years.
At least. So I think the efficiency should be maintained at a reasonable range for at least 10 years.
So in the long run of 10 years, they should at least display a positive return spent.
I believe they do. And hopefully more than 10 years, isn't it 20 years?
I think the efficiency will degrade
It
by roughly
lose.
1 to 2% every year.
Yeah.
So when they first install it, it will be roughly more than 20%, but it will be degraded by 1 to 2% every year. So
Yeah.
after 10 years, it will be roughly half the efficiency as they originally installed. So.
I mean, the insurance, I don't know about China, but the insurance company in California covers the solar panel up until like 25 years old. So After that, usually the solar panel can last for another 5 to 10 years. So yeah,
So they're like.
So you're saying 30 years,
something like that.
Very durable.
but maybe not producing as much as when it started.
Maybe efficiency, yeah.
So there are new like loan or financing possibilities that are being adopted. For example, this session in the Louisiana legislature, in the Rhode Island legislature, I lived in Louisiana for a long time, something called PACE financing, which allows people to put onto their mortgage of their house, or make it a monthly payment, so you don't have to pay for it all at the beginning. You can pay it over the time you own the house, and then the person buying the house also has to keep paying for the
And also
panels.
there's another option of leasing solar panel as opposed to
Right.
purchasing. So you basically rent out your rooftop for 25 years, and then solar companies install the solar panel on it, and then they are in charge of all the maintenance, all the monitoring. You don't have to pay anything, and you enjoy the like $20 reduction of your energy bill every month. And by the end of the 25 years, you can buy the solar panel back. But there's also like cost benefits analysis about like how financially that's profitable compared to purchasing. That's actually the paper I'm writing.
But anyway, what I was saying with that is just that there's going to be a big increase, I think, in the United States in solar adoption. And most of it will come from
Definitely,
China.
because the financial obstacle will basically rule it out, because you don't have to pay anything upfront, and you don't have to pay for the maintenance or whatever.
For China, so I've read that there's a lot of solar investment at it because of the high altitude. Like there's more solar incident on the panels, but the grid is the issue. Transporting the energy to
The
the
thing
other
about,
country.
yeah, that's